I am 73 years old and I have never in my life been handcuffed. Not once. Not when I raised 3 children mostly on my own after my husband passed. Not when I worked 31 years at the county hospital as a nurse. Not when I buried my own mother and had to hold my family together with nothing but grit and prayer. But last month, on a Tuesday evening, 2 police officers put handcuffs on my wrists in my son's driveway while my grandchildren watched through the front window, crying, because my daughter-in-law told the 911 operator that I had attacked her. She forgot one small thing. There was a doorbell camera pointed right at the porch, and it had been recording the entire time. Let me back up a little, because you need to understand who these people are before I tell you what happened that evening. My name is Beatrice Lindgren, and before I go any further, let me tell you a little bit about the life I built long before any of this happened, because I think it matters. I think it matters because when someone accuses you of something monstrous, people start to wonder who you really are underneath, and I want you to know exactly who I am before you hear the rest. I was born in a small farming town, the second of 5 children, and I learned early what it meant to work hard and expect very little in return except the satisfaction of a job well done. I married my husband, Walter, when I was 22 years old, a quiet, steady man who fixed engines for a living and never once raised his voice at me in the 38 years we spent together. We had 3 children. Calvin was our middle child, born between his older brother Douglas and his younger sister Renee. And from the moment he was born, he had this calm, watchful way about him, taking in the world slowly instead of rushing at it, and I always knew he would grow into a gentle, careful man. I spent 31 years working as a nurse at the county hospital, most of them in the pediatric ward, which meant I spent decades of my life holding other people's frightened children, comforting them through fevers and broken bones, and the kind of nights that terrify young parents half to death. I tell you this not to brag, but because I want you to understand that I have spent my entire adult life in service of other people's well-being, that gentleness and patience were not things I merely performed. They were the very fabric of how I earned my living and how I raised my own children. Walter passed away 9 years ago, a heart attack that took him from us far too suddenly, far too soon, and I grieved him the way you grieve half of your own soul leaving your body. But I did not fall apart, because I had grandchildren by then who needed a grandmother who still showed up, still baked, still sat on the floor and played whatever game they wanted to play. And so I picked myself back up and I kept going, the way I imagine most of you watching this have had to do at some point in your own lives too. That is the woman I was walking into that Tuesday evening. Not some bitter, controlling mother-in-law nursing a grudge, but a tired, loving grandmother who simply wanted to help her son and spend time with 2 children who called her Grandma B with more joy in their voices than I have ever felt anywhere else in this world. My son is Calvin Ostrander, named after his father's side of the family, and he is the kindest man I know, soft-spoken, hardworking, the kind of son who calls his mother every Sunday just to check in. 6 years ago, he married a woman named Candace Wexler. From the very first dinner I had with her, something felt off, though I told myself I was being an overprotective mother and that I should give her a chance. She was polished, always put together, always smiling in front of Calvin, but the moment he left the room her smile would drop like a curtain falling, and she would look at me the way you look at something you're trying to figure out how to get rid of. Candace and Calvin have 2 children, Hazel who is 6 and Finn who is 4, and those 2 children are the reason I get up every morning with a purpose. I love them more than I have words for. Hazel has my mother's laugh, this bright, unrestrained sound that fills up a whole room, and Finn has his father's gentle eyes, the kind that make you feel like everything is going to be okay just by looking at them. I babysit them whenever Calvin and Candace need me, which used to be often, back when Candace still pretended to like having me around. Over the years, though, I noticed Candace slowly building walls. She would forget to tell me about school events. She would reschedule visits without warning. She once told Calvin in front of me that maybe the children needed less interference from outside opinions, as if I was some meddling stranger and not the woman who used to rock her husband to sleep when he had colic as a baby. Calvin, bless him, never quite saw it. He loved his wife and he wanted peace in his home, so he smoothed things over, made excuses for her, and told me she was just stressed with the kids and her job. I let it go, time and time again, because I did not want to be the mother-in-law who causes trouble. I wanted my son to have a happy marriage. There were specific moments, though, that I have carried with me quietly for years. Small cuts that never quite healed because I never let them bleed out loud. There was the Christmas 2 years ago when Candace rearranged the seating at dinner so that I ended up at the far end of the table, near the kitchen, while her own parents sat in the places of honor beside Calvin and the children. And when I gently mentioned it afterward, she told me I was being sensitive, that it was simply about table flow and nothing personal at all. There was the time Hazel had a school recital, her very first one, a little kindergarten singing performance that I had circled on my calendar for 3 weeks in advance. And Candace texted me the morning of to say plans had changed, that it was family only this time, only for me to post pictures later that same evening of her own mother and sister sitting proudly in the front row. I did not say anything to Calvin about that one. I told myself it was a misunderstanding, a scheduling mix-up, anything other than what my gut was quietly telling me. There was also the birthday party for Finn's 3rd birthday, where I brought a handmade quilt I had spent nearly 2 months sewing, each patch cut from old baby clothes belonging to Calvin and his siblings when they were small. A keepsake meant to connect 4 generations of this family together in one piece of fabric. Candace thanked me politely in front of everyone, set it aside, and I later learned from Renee that it had been left folded in a closet, never used, while a store-bought blanket sat on Finn's bed instead. Small things, quiet things, the kind of things you cannot really build a case out of, the kind of things that make you sound petty and paranoid if you try to explain them out loud to anyone else, and so I never did, not even to my own daughter until much later. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me even now, even after everything. Candace was not cruel to me every single day. There were good moments too, stretches of months where she would seem to soften, would ask my advice about the children's fevers or their sleep schedules, would even laugh at my old nursing stories once in a great while. I think, looking back, she genuinely wrestled with wanting to like me and feeling threatened by me at the very same time. And I don't think she always knew herself, which feeling was going to win out on any given day. That unpredictability, that walking on eggshells not knowing which version of my daughter-in-law I would encounter, became its own quiet exhaustion that I carried for 6 years without ever fully naming it. But there is only so much a person can swallow before something has to come up for air. The week everything happened, Calvin had a work trip, 3 days out of state for a conference he could not get out of. Candace called me on a Sunday night, her voice syrupy sweet in that way she only used when she needed something from me, and asked if I could come stay at the house to help with the children while he was gone. I said yes immediately, because despite everything, I never let my feelings toward her stop me from being there for Hazel and Finn. I arrived Monday afternoon with a suitcase, a casserole dish, and a bag of the caramel candies Finn likes to sneak when his mother isn't looking. The first day went fine, more or less. Candace was cold but civil, giving me instructions about the children's schedules in that clipped, managerial tone she uses, as if I had never raised children of my own, as if I hadn't raised her husband. I bit my tongue and nodded along. It was Tuesday evening when things fell apart. Finn had refused to eat his dinner, a small thing, the kind of thing that happens with 4-year-olds every single night in every single household in this country. Candace had come home from work irritable, her makeup smudged, her blazer wrinkled, complaining under her breath about her boss before she'd even taken her shoes off. When she saw Finn's plate still full on the table, she snapped at him, raised her voice in a way that made the poor boy's chin start trembling. I stepped in, gently, and said something like, "He's just tired, Candace, let me handle it," reaching to pull his chair back so I could take him to the living room and calm him down. That is when Candace grabbed my wrist hard and told me not to undermine her in her own house. I pulled my arm back, more startled than angry, and told her she was scaring the children and that maybe she needed to take a breath. She got right up in my face then, closer than any grown woman has any business standing to her mother-in-law, and I put my hand up, not to strike her, but simply to create some space between us, the way you would with anyone crowding you in an argument. My palm barely grazed her shoulder. She staggered back like I had shoved her with both hands and full force, stumbling into the doorframe of the kitchen, and let out this sharp gasp, like she was genuinely hurt. I froze, confused, because I knew good and well how light that touch had been. Before I could even ask if she was all right, She was already pulling her phone from her back pocket with shaking hands, dialing 3 numbers I never in a million years thought I would hear her dial because of me. "I need police at my home right now," she said into the phone, her voice cracking with what sounded like real fear. "My mother-in-law just attacked me. She pushed me into the wall. I have 2 small children here and I'm scared." I stood there in that kitchen, 73 years old, staring at this woman lying through her teeth to a 911 dispatcher, and for a moment I genuinely could not process what was happening. Hazel had come running from the living room at the sound of raised voices, and she stood frozen in the hallway with Finn peeking out from behind her legs, both of their little faces pale with confusion and fear. "Grandma didn't do anything," Hazel said, her voice small but clear. "Mommy, Grandma didn't push you." Candace shot her a look, sharp as a blade, and told her to go to her room. Hazel didn't move. I have never been prouder of a 6-year-old in my life. I did not run. I did not argue with her anymore. I simply sat down at the kitchen table, folded my hands, and waited, because I knew the truth, and I trusted that the truth would come out eventually. Even if it took time, I did not particularly want to spend proving my own innocence to strangers with badges. While we waited those 12 long minutes for the police to arrive, Candace paced the kitchen, glancing at me every so often with an expression I could not quite place at the time, though looking back now, I recognize it as the look of someone who has just done something they cannot undo and is trying to convince themselves it was justified. She did not comfort Finn, who was still crying softly in the hallway with his sister's arm wrapped around him. She did not check on Hazel, who kept peeking around the corner to look at me, her small face pinched with worry, mouthing the words, "Are you okay, Grandma?" without making a sound. I nodded at her gently, trying to keep my own voice steady, trying to be the calm in that house, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. At one point, Hazel walked bravely into the kitchen, planted her small feet on the tile, and looked directly at her mother. "Mommy, why are you lying?" she asked, in that clear, unflinching way children have before the world teaches them to soften their honesty. Candace snapped at her to go to her room immediately, her voice sharper than I had ever heard her use with either of the children before. And for the first time that night, I saw something crack in Candace's own composure. A flicker of something like shame crossing her face before she smoothed it back over into practiced distress for when the officers arrived. I remember thinking, sitting there at that table with my hands folded, that this was the strangest kind of helplessness I had ever experienced. I had spent 3 decades as a nurse learning how to stay calm in genuine emergencies, how to keep my voice level while a child seized in front of me or a parent screamed in a hospital hallway. And none of that training had prepared me for the particular helplessness of sitting quietly, while someone I had loved and welcomed into my family constructed a lie about me in real time. A lie I could see forming right in front of my eyes, and could do absolutely nothing to stop. The police arrived 12 minutes later. 2 officers, a young man who looked barely older than my grandson would be someday, and an older woman with tired eyes who I could tell had seen 100 domestic calls just like this one, or thought she had. Candace met them at the door already crying, mascara running down her cheeks in perfect little tracks, telling them I had grabbed her and thrown her against the wall, that I had a history of anger issues, that she was afraid for her children's safety with me in the house. Every word of it was a lie, but she said it with such conviction, such practiced anguish, that I watched the officers' faces shift from neutral to sympathetic to suspicious of me within the span of about 90 seconds. They asked me to step outside. I complied. I have spent my whole life respecting authority, and I was not about to start resisting it now, even though every fiber of my being was screaming that this was wrong. This was backwards. This was a woman using the system to humiliate her own husband's mother over a plate of uneaten chicken and rice. The older officer asked me what happened, and I told her calmly, exactly as it occurred. She listened, but I could see in her eyes that she had already made up her mind based on Candace's performance. Domestic violence calls are serious, and I understand why officers have to take them seriously. I do. I raised a son who became a good man precisely because I taught him that women's safety matters. That night, standing in that driveway with the porch light shining down on me and my grandchildren's terrified faces pressed against the front window glass, I understood for the first time what it feels like to be disbelieved simply because someone else told a better, more dramatic version of events than the truth ever could. They placed me in handcuffs, cold metal against wrists that have changed 1,000 diapers, cooked 10,000 meals, held my husband's hand as he took his last breath, and cradled Calvin and Hazel and Finn in their earliest, most fragile days. I did not cry in that driveway. I refused to give Candace the satisfaction. But something inside me cracked quietly, privately, in a place no one else could see. They took me to the station. I called Calvin from a payphone because they had taken my cell phone as part of processing, and I will never forget the sound of his voice when I told him his wife had me arrested for attacking her. Silence, then a long, shaky breath. Then, "Mom, that doesn't sound like her. Are you sure it wasn't a misunderstanding?" That question hurt worse than the handcuffs. I spent that night in a holding cell. I did not sleep. I sat on a thin metal bench with a scratchy blanket around my shoulders, listening to the sounds of a place I never imagined I would find myself, replaying the entire evening over and over, wondering how a plate of uneaten chicken had turned into the worst night of my adult life. There was another woman in the cell with me for part of that night, much younger, maybe in her 30s, who had been brought in on a completely unrelated matter. And at some point in the small hours of the morning, she asked me quietly what a grandmother like me was doing in a place like this. I told her the whole thing, start to finish, and she listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she just shook her head and said, "The world's gotten real good at believing whoever cries the prettiest." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the weeks since. I thought, too, about all the years I had spent on the other side of situations like this, working in that pediatric ward, watching exhausted parents come in at 3 a.m. with sick children, watching how quickly fear can turn into anger, how quickly anger can turn into blame, how quickly blame can land on whoever happens to be standing closest when the panic sets in. I had counseled dozens of young mothers over the decades on how to manage their tempers, how to step outside and breathe before saying something they would regret. And here I was, on the receiving end of exactly the kind of unchecked anger I used to gently warn against. Except this time, it had a badge and handcuffs attached to it instead of just harsh words. The holding cell was cold, the fluorescent lights never quite turned off, and somewhere down the hallway I could hear someone crying on and off for what felt like hours. I did not cry that night. I want to tell you that with some pride, though I'm not entirely sure pride is the right word for it. I think I was simply too stunned, too far outside of anything I recognized as my own life, to access tears at all. It was only days later, once I was home and safe, and the immediate danger had passed, that the crying finally came, all at once, in my own kitchen, alone, gripping the edge of my counter the way you grip something solid when the ground underneath you no longer feels steady. The next morning, a bail hearing was set, and my daughter, Calvin's younger sister Renee, drove 3 hours through the night to post my bail the moment it was set. When I walked out of that station into the gray morning light, Renee wrapped her arms around me and did not let go for a long time. She smelled like coffee and highway air, and I have never been more grateful for another human being showing up for me. Calvin was there too, standing a few feet back, and I could see the conflict written all over his face, torn between the wife he loved and the mother who raised him. He hugged me stiffly and said he didn't know what to think, that Candace was still insisting I had attacked her, that the children were confused and upset, and he needed time to sort out what actually happened. I understood, even as it broke my heart a little more. Loyalty is a complicated thing when it's split down the middle like that. Word got around fast. The way it always does in families and small towns. Candace had apparently already called her mother, her sister, and half her church group, painting herself as the victim of a violent, unstable mother-in-law who had finally snapped after years of jealousy and control. People I had known for years, people who had eaten at my table, started looking at me differently at the grocery store, at church, in the parking lot of the pharmacy. Whispers, sideways glances, the particular cruelty of a small community that has already decided your guilt before you've had a chance to speak. One afternoon during that week, I ran into an old friend from church. A woman named Josephine, who I had known for over 20 years, someone who had sat beside me at countless potlucks and prayer meetings. She saw me in the produce aisle at the grocery store, and instead of her usual warm greeting, she gave me a tight, uncomfortable smile, and found a reason to hurry off toward the dairy section before I could even say hello properly. I stood there holding a bag of apples, feeling smaller than I had felt in decades, understanding for the first time just how far and how fast a lie can travel once it's given a head start. My neighbor of 15 years, a kind older gentleman named Arthur, who used to help me carry my groceries in when my knees were giving me trouble, stopped waving at me from his porch that week. Even the mailman, a young fellow who usually chatted with me about the weather for a few minutes every afternoon, started leaving my mail quickly and hurrying back to his truck without so much as a nod in my direction. And I understood then just how far a piece of gossip can travel through a neighborhood in only a matter of days, faster than any truth ever seems able to catch up to it. I don't know exactly what version of the story reached him, whether it was Candace's church group gossip filtering through the neighborhood grapevine or something else entirely, but the silence from people I had trusted for years cut deeper than I expected it to. It is one thing to be falsely accused. It is another thing entirely to watch the people around you decide, without ever asking you directly, that the accusation must be true simply because it was said with enough tears and enough conviction. I will admit to you honestly, there were nights during that week where I sat alone in my house and wondered if I would ever get my grandchildren back, if Calvin would choose his marriage over his mother, if the truth even mattered anymore in a world where the loudest, most convincing performance wins. I would lie awake replaying Hazel's small brave voice in that hallway, telling myself that at least one person in that house had refused to let the lie stand unchallenged, and I would try to let that be enough to fall asleep on, even when it wasn't quite enough at all. But then, 4 days after the arrest, Calvin called me, and his voice sounded different. Steadier. Older somehow, like something in him had shifted. He told me he'd remembered the doorbell camera. It was a security system Candace herself had insisted on installing 8 months earlier. After a string of package thefts in their neighborhood, a sleek little camera mounted above the front door that recorded continuous video and audio of anyone approaching or standing on the porch, connected to an app on both of their phones. Calvin had never bothered checking the footage before, honestly hadn't even thought of it in the chaos of that night, but sitting alone in his hotel room 3 states away, gnawing on guilt and confusion, it suddenly occurred to him that the porch camera's microphone was sensitive enough to pick up sound from just inside the front door, especially when that door had been left slightly ajar, which it had been that evening because Finn had been playing near it earlier. He told me later that his hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the phone twice, while he was scrolling back through the timestamps, trying to find the exact window from Tuesday evening. The hotel room was dark except for the glow of his phone screen, and he said he felt sick to his stomach the entire time, half hoping the footage would somehow prove his wife right, because some small, loyal part of him still did not want to believe she was capable of what I had described. That is a painful thing to sit with, as a mother, knowing that even your own son needed proof before he could fully choose to believe you over his wife. But I have made my peace with it, because I understand that loving 2 people who are suddenly in direct conflict with each other is its own particular kind of anguish, and I do not think less of him for needing to see it with his own eyes. He pulled up the app. He found the footage from Tuesday night, and he watched, in horror, as the truth unfolded in a way no lie could survive. The audio was muffled but clear enough. You could hear Candace's raised voice at Finn first, then my calmer voice trying to intervene, then the scuffle of movement, and most damning of all, you could hear Candace's own words, spoken low enough that she clearly thought no one but me could hear them, right before she grabbed the doorframe and gasped dramatically. "I'm so sick of you undermining me in my own house. You want to play the victim? Fine, watch this." She had staged it, on camera without realizing the camera could hear her. She had planned the fall, planned the gasp, planned the performance in the 2 or 3 seconds before she dialed 911, all because she was furious that a 4-year-old wouldn't finish his dinner and I had dared to step in. Calvin told me he sat in that hotel room and watched it 11 times, like he needed to make sure his ears weren't deceiving him, before he called the police department directly and asked what the process was for submitting exculpatory evidence in a case against his own mother. Then he called Renee. Then he called me, and for the first time in that entire ordeal, I heard my son's voice break with something other than confusion. It broke with rage and with shame, and with a kind of grief for the mistake he'd almost let happen. He flew home early the next morning. What followed was, if I'm being completely honest with you, one of the most satisfying and also one of the most painful stretches of time I have ever lived through, because vindication rarely comes without its own kind of wreckage. Calvin brought the footage straight to the district attorney's office along with his own written statement. The charges against me were dropped within 48 hours, and not quietly either, because the assistant district attorney who reviewed the footage was, in her own words, deeply troubled by what she called a textbook example of weaponizing the justice system through a false report, and she opened a separate inquiry into whether Candace should face charges herself for filing a false police report, which in our state can carry real penalties, fines, potential jail time, and a permanent mark on your record. My own attorney, a sharp young woman named Priya, who Renee had found for me within hours of my arrest, told me that cases like mine are far more common than most people realize, and far harder to fight without exactly the kind of evidence that fell into our laps almost by accident. She told me stories, careful not to share names or identifying details, of other clients she had represented over the years, grandparents and in-laws, and even, once, an ex-husband, all accused of things they did not do by someone who understood exactly how quickly the system moves to protect an alleged victim, and how slowly it moves to reconsider once that initial narrative has been set. Without that doorbell footage, she told me plainly, my case would likely have come down to my word against Candace's, and in a courtroom, an articulate, tearful young mother often has an advantage over a 73-year-old woman that has nothing to do with who is actually telling the truth. That conversation with Priya changed something in me. It made me angry in a colder, more focused way than the initial shock and hurt had allowed for. I started to understand that this was not just about Candace and me and one bad Tuesday evening. It was about how easily any of us, any family, any innocent person, could be swept up and disbelieved simply because the system is built to react quickly to protect people. And reacting quickly does not always leave room for reacting accurately. I decided, in that moment, that even if I chose forgiveness for Candace personally later on, I was not going to pretend that what happened to me didn't matter, didn't deserve to be taken seriously, didn't deserve real accountability within the system that had so nearly failed me completely. I won't lie to you and pretend some small, human part of me didn't want that. Some small part of me wanted Candace to sit in that same cold holding cell, to feel those same handcuffs, to understand exactly what it feels like to have your own truth disbelieved by people wearing badges. Some part of me wanted her mother and her sister and her entire church group to know, in vivid, undeniable detail, exactly what kind of person she had shown herself to be behind closed doors. I wanted her exposed the way I had been exposed, humiliated the way I had been humiliated, and for a few days, I let myself sit in that feeling without apologizing for it, because I had earned the right to feel it. Calvin, too, was not interested in protecting her from consequences at first. He moved out of the house temporarily, took Hazel and Finn to stay with Renee for a few nights while he figured out what he wanted to do, and told Candace flatly that he had seen the footage, that he knew what she had said, and that he was disgusted. Their marriage, which had already been fraying at the edges for longer than any of us had wanted to admit, seemed to be heading toward a complete and permanent collapse. Candace's own mother, when she saw the footage that Renee had sent her, called Candace and told her she was ashamed that she hadn't raised her daughter to manipulate people like that, and the two of them didn't speak for almost 2 weeks. Candace's sister posted something vague and cutting on social media about people who use fear as a weapon that everyone in the family understood was aimed squarely at her. Candace's carefully built reputation, the same reputation she had used to paint me as the villain, began crumbling in on itself with a speed that almost frightened me. Renee, my daughter, took the whole ordeal the hardest out of everyone in the family besides me, I think, because she had always been protective of me in a way that sometimes bordered on fierce, ever since we lost Walter, and she seemed to appoint herself my unofficial guardian even though I never asked her to. She was the one who drove through the night to bail me out. She was the one who called Priya the lawyer within an hour of hearing what had happened. And she was the one who, once the footage surfaced, wanted the most severe consequences possible for Candace, telling me in no uncertain terms over the phone that she thought I was being far too soft by even entertaining the idea of forgiveness. We argued about it, actually argued, the two of us, in a way we rarely do, because Renee felt that forgiving Candace too quickly would somehow cheapen what I had gone through, would send a message that this kind of behavior could be waved away as long as an apology eventually came. I understood her anger because it came from love, but I told her that forgiveness was mine to give or withhold, not hers, and that I needed her to trust that I knew my own heart on this even if she disagreed with where it landed. I sat with all of this for several days, watching the consequences ripple outward, watching a woman who had tried to destroy my relationship with my grandchildren now facing the possible destruction of her marriage, her family relationships, and potentially her freedom. And I want to tell you honestly, there was a night, about a week after the footage came out, when Renee called me and said Candace wanted to come see me, alone, to talk, and my first instinct was to say absolutely not. But then I thought about Hazel's small, brave voice in that hallway. Grandma didn't do anything. I thought about Finn, 4 years old, who had watched his grandmother get put in handcuffs in his own driveway. An image that would likely live somewhere in the back of his mind for the rest of his life, whether he consciously remembered it or not. I thought about what kind of grandmother I wanted to be to those two children, not just for the next few weeks while everyone was still angry, but for the next 20, 30 years, however long I am blessed to have with them. Did I want them growing up in a fractured family, bouncing between resentful adults, learning that love is something you weaponize when you don't get your way? Or did I want to show them, even now, even after everything, what it actually looks like to hold someone accountable and still choose grace? So I said yes. I told Renee to bring Candace over. She showed up 2 days later looking like a different woman than the polished, put-together person I had known for 6 years. Her eyes were swollen, her hands trembling as she sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same kind of table Finn had refused to eat his dinner at, the table where all of this had started. She didn't try to make excuses at first. She just sat there, quiet, for a long moment before she finally said, "I don't even know why I said what I said that night. I was so angry, and it just came out, and then it was already happening and I didn't know how to stop it." I let her sit in that discomfort for a while before I spoke. I told her that I had raised 3 children mostly alone, that I understood exhaustion, understood the particular kind of desperate anger that comes from feeling unseen and unsupported, understood what it is to snap at the people closest to you because they're the ones who are there. But I told her, plainly, that understanding where a lie comes from does not excuse the lie itself, especially not a lie that could have taken years away from her own husband and mother-in-law, especially not a lie that put handcuffs on a 73-year-old woman in front of 2 small children who trusted both of us to keep them safe. She cried. Really cried, not the practiced tears from that Tuesday night, the raw, ugly kind that comes from somewhere real. She told me she'd felt threatened by me since the beginning, that she'd grown up watching her own mother clash bitterly with her grandmother for years over exactly the kind of small territorial disputes I had never even realized I was participating in. Things like who got to hold the baby first at family gatherings, whose opinion carried more weight about school choices, whose house felt more like home to visiting grandchildren. She told me that somewhere in her mind, without ever consciously deciding to, she had cast me as the villain in a script that had actually been written by someone else entirely, years before I even met her, and she had spent 6 years bracing for me to become that same person, twisting every gesture of love I offered into something sinister in her own mind, until eventually the fear became a kind of self-fulfilling weapon she picked up without even fully realizing she was doing it. She told me about the specific morning it all seemed to crystallize for her, back when Hazel was still a baby, when I had offered, gently, to help her adjust the way she was swaddling the infant because the blanket had been wrapped too loose. And I was worried about it coming undone in the crib. I remembered that moment too, vaguely, as nothing more than an ordinary, forgettable piece of grandmotherly advice offered in passing. To Candace, though exhausted and hormonal and drowning in new motherhood, it had landed like a verdict, like a confirmation that I saw her as an inadequate mother. And she told me she had carried that wound quietly for years, letting it calcify into resentment she never once brought to me directly, choosing instead to nurse it in silence and let it color everything that came after. I sat with that for a long moment before I responded, because I wanted to be honest with her rather than simply comforting. I told her that I understood, genuinely, how a small moment can lodge itself sideways in a person's heart and grow into something much larger than it ever should have been. I told her about my own mother-in-law, decades ago, and a comment about my pot roast that I had carried around like a stone in my pocket for nearly 15 years before I finally let it go. But I also told her, as gently and as firmly as I could manage, that the difference between her wound and mine was that I had never turned my resentment into a weapon capable of taking her children away from her, capable of putting her in handcuffs, capable of destroying her reputation in front of an entire community. Hurt is human. What she did with her hurt was a choice, and it was the choice, not the original wound, that I needed her to understand and take full ownership of if we were ever going to move forward from this in any real way. I am not a psychologist. I don't know if that explanation is entirely true or partly a story she has told herself to survive her own shame. But I have lived long enough to know that hurt people often hurt people, and that does not make the hurting acceptable, but it does sometimes make it understandable. And understanding is the first small step towards something better, if the person is actually willing to walk the rest of that road. I thought, sitting there across from her at that kitchen table, about all the years I spent in that pediatric ward watching families in crisis. I remembered one particular mother, many years ago now, who screamed at me in a hospital hallway, accused me of not caring about her sick child, said things to me that I still remember word for word decades later. Things that stung far worse than anything a stranger's cruelty could have managed, precisely because I had been trying so hard to help her. I remembered how, 3 days later, once her daughter had recovered and gone home, that same mother came back to the hospital with a card and a box of chocolates and cried apologizing to me for 20 minutes straight. Fear does strange things to people. It turns the people trying to help you into the people you lash out at, because they are the only ones standing close enough to hit. I am not saying Candace's fear justifies what she did. I want to be very clear about that, because I know some of you watching this might feel like I am making excuses for her, and I promise you I am not. But I have decided, at 73 years old, that I would rather spend my remaining years trying to understand people than spend them nursing anger at people, because anger has never once, in my entire life, made me feel better in the long run. It has only ever made me feel heavier. I told her I forgave her. I want to be very clear with you about what that forgiveness did and did not mean. It did not mean I pretended nothing happened. It did not mean I told Calvin to drop his own hurt and go running back to a marriage that needed real work. It did not mean I let the district attorney's office quietly close the inquiry without any accountability at all. Candace ultimately accepted a deal that included mandatory counseling, community service, and a formal acknowledgement on record of the false report, rather than the harsher path of jail time the DA's office could have pursued, and I supported that outcome because I believed, and still believe, that consequences and forgiveness are not opposites. You can hold someone accountable and still choose not to carry hatred in your chest for the rest of your life. Hatred is heavy, and I am 73 years old. I do not have decades left to spend carrying something that heavy. What forgiveness did mean was that I chose to stop wanting her destroyed. I chose to stop hoping her mother would never speak to her again, to stop hoping her marriage would collapse entirely, to stop wanting her humiliated the way she had tried to humiliate me. I chose, instead, to hope she would actually change, because a changed Candace was so much better for Hazel and Finn than a destroyed one. It has been a little over a month now since that night in the driveway. Calvin and Candace are still together, though they are in counseling twice a week, and Calvin tells me it is slow, honest, difficult work. The kind of work that doesn't make for a satisfying dramatic ending, but does make for real healing if both people actually show up for it. Candace has started her own individual counseling as well, working through whatever it is inside her that made lying to a 911 dispatcher feel like a reasonable solution to an argument over chicken and rice. Calvin came to see me alone one evening a few weeks ago, sat on my back porch with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and apologized to me for the way he had hesitated that night on the phone before believing me. I told him he didn't need to apologize, that I understood the impossible position he'd been in, but he shook his head and told me he needed to say it anyway, out loud, so that it existed somewhere outside of just his own conscience. He told me that watching that footage had done something to him, had cracked open a part of him that used to smooth everything over to keep the peace. And that he didn't want to be a man who smoothed over things that shouldn't be smoothed over anymore. Not for Candace, not for anyone, not even for me if I was ever the one in the wrong someday. I have watched my son grow into someone new over these past few weeks, someone with a little more backbone, a little more willingness to sit in discomfort rather than paper over it. And as much as I wish none of this had ever needed to happen for that growth to occur, I cannot help but feel a strange, complicated gratitude for the person he is becoming on the other side of it. He still loves his wife. He has told me, plainly, that he believes people can change if the change is real and sustained rather than performed, and he has chosen to give Candace the chance to prove that to him over time rather than all at once. I respect that choice, even on the days when the mother in me wants to tell him to protect his heart more fiercely than he seems willing to. She and I are not close, not yet, maybe not ever in the way I once hoped we might be. But 2 weeks ago she came to pick up the children from my house after a Sunday visit, and instead of the cold, clipped exchange we used to have at the door, she stood on my porch for a moment and said, quietly, "Thank you for not trying to destroy me when you could have." I told her I didn't do it for her. I did it for Hazel and Finn, and for the woman I want to still be able to look at in the mirror when I'm 80. She nodded, and for the first time in 6 years, I think she actually understood something true about me. Hazel still talks about that night sometimes, in the unfiltered way children do. A few days ago she asked me, completely out of nowhere while we were making cookies, "Grandma, why did the policeman think you did something bad?" I told her, as gently and honestly as I could, that sometimes grown-ups say things that aren't true because they're scared or angry. And that it's important to always tell the truth even when it's hard, especially when telling the truth might get someone else in trouble. She thought about that for a moment, flour on her little hands, and said, "I told the truth. I told them you didn't do it." I told her that was one of the bravest things I had ever seen anyone do, 6 years old or 90, and I meant every word of it. Finn is too young to fully understand what happened, but he still climbs into my lap every chance he gets and falls asleep against my shoulder the same way he did before any of this happened. And honestly, that alone tells me everything is going to be all right, eventually, in whatever shape, all right, ends up taking for this family. There is something almost holy about the trust of a small child who has no idea what handcuffs or holding cells or false accusations even are, who simply knows that Grandma's shoulder is warm and safe and exactly where he wants to fall asleep. And I try to hold on to that feeling on the harder days, the days when I still catch myself flinching a little at the sound of a police siren passing on the street outside my house. I think about that doorbell camera a lot. Such a small, unremarkable little device, mounted above a front door mostly to catch package thieves, and it ended up being the only witness willing to tell the truth when every human being in that house had their own version, their own fear, their own agenda clouding what actually happened. I have started to think of it, a little sentimentally I'll admit, as a kind of silent guardian angel, one made of plastic and wiring instead of feathers and light, sitting quietly above that door for 8 months without a single dramatic moment to justify its presence. And then, on the one night it truly mattered, doing exactly what it was built to do without flinching, without bias, without caring whose version of events was more convincing. Candace actually mentioned that camera to me once, weeks later, with a strange, rueful little laugh. She said she remembered picking it out herself, comparing 3 different models online, choosing the one with the best night vision and the most sensitive microphone because she wanted to feel safe in her own home after those package thefts in the neighborhood. She told me it was almost funny, in the darkest possible way, that the very device she'd installed to protect herself and her family ended up being the thing that protected me instead, protected the truth instead, protected all of us really, from a version of this family's future where a lie was simply allowed to stand because it was the loudest voice in the room. I am not a vengeful woman by nature, but I will tell you plainly, if that camera had not caught what it caught, I do not know where I would be right now. Maybe still fighting charges. Maybe estranged from my son forever. Maybe sitting alone in my house wondering if the people who loved me would ever fully believe me over the polished, tearful performance of someone who knew exactly how to work a room. Instead, I am sitting here today, having just watched my granddaughter learn to ride a bike without training wheels for the first time this past weekend. wobbling down the sidewalk in front of my house with her tongue poking out in concentration, the exact way her father used to do at that age. Calvin jogging along beside her with one hand hovering near the back of the seat, just in case. Both of them laughing so hard by the third try that Hazel nearly toppled over from giggling rather than from losing her balance. I stood on my porch and cried a little, the good kind of crying, the kind that comes from watching ordinary life simply continue on the way it's supposed to, after so many weeks of wondering whether it ever would again. I have also just heard my grandson tell me, unprompted, that I make the best pancakes in the whole world. Better than anybody, which I promise you is a direct quote, delivered with syrup still dripping off his chin, and both hands raised triumphantly in the air like he just won some kind of championship. My son calls me every Sunday still, but now he also calls on Wednesdays sometimes too, just to check in, just to make sure I know he sees me, that he chose to trust the truth even when it cost him comfort in his own marriage to do it. If there is one thing I want you to take from all of this, it is that the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, even when it feels buried under someone else's louder, more convincing lie. I know that is not always a comfortable thing to hear, because eventually can feel like an eternity when you are the one sitting in a holding cell, or the one watching your own family look at you with doubt in their eyes, or the one lying awake wondering if anyone will ever believe your version of events again. I do not have a tidy answer for how long, eventually, takes, because I think it is different for every single person who has ever had to wait for it. But I can tell you that in my own life, holding on to my composure, refusing to match lie with lie or cruelty with cruelty, turned out to matter more than I ever expected it to, because it meant that when the truth did finally arrive, there was still a version of me standing on the other side of it worth returning to. It might take a doorbell camera. It might take a brave 6-year-old refusing to stay quiet in a hallway. It might just take time and patience and the refusal to give up on people who love you enough to eventually see clearly. But it comes. And when it does, what you choose to do with that vindication says more about who you are than the lie ever could have said about who you were accused of being. I chose forgiveness, not because Candace deserved it in that moment, but because I deserved to put that weight down, and because 2 small children deserved a grandmother who taught them. By example, that being right and being kind are not mutually exclusive things. I think about all the grandmothers out there watching this who have gone through something similar, maybe not exactly this, maybe not a false 911 call, but some version of being disbelieved, dismissed, or pushed to the margins of your own family by someone who decided early on that you were the problem rather than the person you actually are. I want you to know that your patience is not weakness. I want you to know that staying calm while someone else loses their composure is not the same thing as losing the argument. And I want you to know that the truth, even when it takes its time, even when it hides behind a small, unremarkable camera mounted above a front door, has a way of finding its way to the surface eventually if you are willing to hold steady long enough to let it arrive. There is also something I want to say to anyone watching this who might see a little too much of themselves in Candace rather than in me, someone who has maybe let an old wound curdle into resentment they've never fully examined, someone who has maybe said something in anger that they knew, even as it left their mouth, was not entirely true. It is not too late to be honest. It is not too late to sit down at someone's kitchen table and tell them the truth even when the truth makes you look small. The version of Candace who finally told me the truth at my kitchen table is a braver version of her than the one who called 911 that Tuesday night, and I believe, genuinely believe, that people are capable of becoming braver, more honest versions of themselves if they are willing to do the uncomfortable work it requires. My grandchildren are growing up fast. Hazel lost her first tooth just last week and insisted on showing everyone the gap in her smile for 3 days straight before she would even let me take a photograph of it. Finn has started saying full sentences that sound remarkably like things I say, calling his toys just precious, the exact way I do, which makes Calvin laugh every single time he catches it. I get to be present for these small, ordinary miracles because the truth came out in time, because a 6-year-old refused to stay quiet, because a small camera above a front door happened to be listening when it mattered most. And because, in the end, I decided that the family I still had left was worth more to me than the satisfaction of watching someone else suffer the way I had suffered. I still keep that quilt I made, the one that sat folded in the closet for so long. Candace brought it back to me a few weeks ago, washed and neatly folded, and asked if it would be all right for Finn to use it on cold nights going forward. I told her that would make me happier than she could possibly know, and now it sits on his bed every single night, 4 generations of this family stitched together in cotton and thread, finally being used the way it was always meant to be used. All right, that's my whole heart poured out for you today. If you made it all the way to the end of this, I would love to know where in the world you're watching from, so go ahead and drop your city in the comments below. I read every single one of them with my coffee in the morning. It's become one of my favorite parts of the day. And if you love your grandma, whether she's still with you or watching over you from somewhere else, do an old woman a favor and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone you love. Until next time, take care of each other out there. Hold on to your patience even when it feels absolutely impossible some days. And never, ever underestimate the quiet power of a small hidden camera, a brave child, or a tired grandmother who simply refuses to stop telling the truth, no matter how long it takes for the whole wide world to finally catch up and truly, truly listen.